For Nixon TV, I'm Jonathan Movroydis. How has Richard Nixon left the world we live in? What are the consequences of his politics and policies? Here with us to discuss this is Douglas Schoen. Douglas Schoen has been an influential Democratic advisor to Presidents Bill Clinton, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and Senator Evan Bayh. He's a Fox News contributor and a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He's also the author of a monumental new book called The Nixon Effect: How Richard Nixon's Presidency Fundamentally Changed American Politics. Douglas Schoen, thank you very much for joining us. Why ultimately did you write The Nixon Effect?
My feeling was that President Nixon has been one of the transcendent presidents of the modern era, certainly since World War II, and I felt it was important to document his record, accomplishments, and impact on our political system.
What do you think some of the biggest misconceptions of the Nixon presidency are?
That he was a hard-nosed conservative, that he didn't care about governing, that he was insensitive to the needs or will of the people, and that ultimately his presidency was a failed presidency. I think all of those are wrong.
Yet you say that more than any other politician, Richard Nixon has shaped the ideological identities of both of the national parties today. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, the Democrats, as a result of President Nixon, both moving to the left and because of Watergate, moved to the far left, which is reflected, I think, in the politics of President Obama to some extent, and certainly Senator Sanders, the Democratic candidate for the presidential nomination, who was giving a spirited fight as I speak to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. On the Republican side, President Nixon governed from the center, was able to co-opt the right wing of the party, but as a result of the president's policies, which a centrist like myself has great respect and deference for, the right wing of the party became ascendant, whether it be through the Howard Jarvis Proposition 13 in 1978, the Ronald Reagan election in 1980, the subsequent development of the Tea Party, really the development of the right wing of the Republican Party, I think is a reflection and a reaction to the Nixon presidency.
You know, you mentioned Goldwater. There's also the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. You talk about Nixon being a pragmatist. Despite being a pragmatist, though, he must have had some sort of political ideology.
I think his ideology was to get as much done within the confines of the environment he was operating in as possible. You mentioned the Rockefeller wing and the Goldwater wing. He was able to appeal to both in 68 and 72. And as a realist in foreign policy and a moderate to liberal in domestic policy, I think he was able to assuage the concerns for the five and a half years he was in the Oval Office.
You write that Nixon demonstrates this kind of a conservative populism. You know, it doesn't sound that dissimilar to what we see with Donald Trump's candidacy today. How is this so if Nixon's policies seem so pragmatic and moderate?
Well, Nixon understood that there were disaffected voters. He called them the silent majority, and the focus then was the turmoil, both from race riots and also crime in the streets. Now we have the issue of terror, the issue of immigration, and I would say that what Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, and indeed the Republican candidates for president are talking about, are far more vitriolic and divisive than anything Richard Nixon ever said on his worst day.
You know, you say responding to the silent majority, these disaffected people. Who were they demographically?
Middle-aged, middle-class people who didn't protest, who paid their taxes, went to church, but were aggrieved that there were anti-war protesters, aggrieved with crime in the streets, aggrieved with riots, who basically felt that traditional values were being undermined.
And how did he ultimately respond to them? How did he ultimately respond to their wishes?
Well, he responded to a very large degree. He spoke out against busing for policies that were tough on crime. He spoke out in defending and supporting our troops. And if you remember, he also talked about honoring America, something that in different ways Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and the other Republicans are talking about as we speak today.
And you bring up his effect on both the Democratic and Republican parties. How did he, firstly, how did he transform the GOP into what it is today? How did he modernize the party?
Well, the Republican Party at its best is a coalition. And Donald Trump was able to win the votes of moderate Republicans, the so-called country club establishment wing, the more conservative Southern Republicans who were emerging and who were facilitated with his efforts, as well as some of what came to be called Reagan Democrats. So he put together a coalition that, as you know, in 1972 at its peak, got 60% of the vote.
Can we attribute the ascendancy of the Reagan Democrats and the coalition that Reagan put together to what Nixon put together in 72?
68 and 72 certainly was a precursor of what Reagan was able to do. Yes, absolutely.
You devote 2 chapters to the Democratic side of this. You call it Nixonizing the Democrats. How did he attract these voters, the people who, certain proportion of people who voted for FDR and JFK and LBJ?
They voted for Nixon on cultural and social issues. Very similar, though different issues, to what Republicans are running on now. And Nixon had an acute sense on how to target his message to constituency groups, what we now call micro-targeting. He was able to do instinctively. And those I know who knew President Nixon very well said that his political mind was so fine he could discuss city by city, congressional district by congressional district, each and every key area in the United States in a way that few, if any, could do until Bill Clinton came along.
Moving to foreign policy, on page 78 of the Nixon Effect, you write, Nixon's opening to China is the silent context behind Reagan's victory in the Cold War. How did Richard Nixon's overall Cold War policy affect the United States and its foreign policy?
Well, when Nixon took power as president in '69, we had no serious and significant relations with the Russians. The Chinese were totally isolated. The Cold War was in full effect, and we were fighting the calamitous war in Vietnam. President Nixon was able to reach out to the Chinese, then accept an invitation to go to Moscow, I guess 3 months later, sign a series of arms control agreements with the Russians that became the basis of détente. And while it was not quick enough for those on the left, he did Vietnamize and ultimately end the Vietnam War through his policies.
You wrote a cleverly titled chapter, They Didn't Listen to Nixon. First you target the Republicans and the consequences of the crusading foreign policies of the years of George W. Bush. How could that administration have looked to Nixon in a post 9/11 world?
I don't think Richard Nixon would have gone to Iraq in the way that he did. I think he would have been more cautious and judicious. And I think that Richard Nixon certainly would not have let a red line be crossed in Syria as President Obama did. I don't think President Nixon would have let the Russians go into Syria in the way they did. So I think George W. Bush was somewhat more reckless than President Nixon ever would have been. And President Obama was much more, I think, reticent to engage than President Nixon was. So 2 extremes, neither one really heeding the president's strategic, realistic approach.
Do you think the electorate today is looking for a realist in foreign policy?
I think the electorate is looking for a realist in foreign policy and domestic policy. someone who can bring the country together, produce results, and govern with a sense of American interests first, rather than politics, policy, or ideology.
Turning to the domestic side, why do you consider Nixon as one of the last great liberal presidents?
If you look at his record, Environmental Protection Administration, the number of schools desegregated in the South from 10% to 70%, family assistance plan, proposing national health insurance, being a proponent and advocate of the Philadelphia Plan, affirmative action, and ultimately black capitalism. Ultimately, President Nixon did more to advance a progressive social agenda than any president, I think, since, leading President Obama to say that the most liberal president in recent memory was Richard Nixon, not Barack Obama.
How would you reconcile that? Granted, there are many of those initiatives, but how would you reconcile that to, trying to unravel the Great Society, through welfare reform and general revenue sharing, that is the transfer of power and revenue to state and local governments?
I think you can be in favor of progressive policies, but also believe that you need to devolve power to the states. And I think Bill Clinton, certainly I was part of it, proposed and implemented welfare reform successfully in 1996. So I don't think these are just pure liberal and conservative policies to have limits to how long you can get welfare and work requirements. Strike me as common sense, not liberal or conservative.
And how does Richard Nixon continue to affect the political landscape today?
Well, I think every politician is looking to put together the kind of coalition that he put together in 1972. Every politician is trying to have the magisterial impact on foreign policy that he had, and every politician is trying to have the command of domestic policy that he had as well. I haven't seen anybody recently who's been close to Richard Nixon. Bill Clinton, in substantial measure, yes, but other than that, not really.
And I'll leave you with one last question.
Please.
How's the average American citizen affected by his legacy and policies?
Well, I think if you look at his domestic agenda, you can see that he's had a wide-ranging impact on our domestic policy in ways that continue to this day. And if you look at his foreign policy, one of the things that I would say is he said, look, we have to engage with Boris Yeltsin, otherwise Russia will turn in the direction of an authoritarian nation, and it will be many, many years before the country's democratized. He was prophetic in predicting the rise of Vladimir Putin. And on China, we would continue to have good relations there in a way that arguably would not have been the case but for the initiative that Richard Nixon initiated to China. So in a wide range of areas, I think it's fair to say Richard Nixon's impact is still being felt on our country.
Douglas Schoen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.